Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm doing the 25.10 mid lane tier list. So if you enjoy content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were a lot of changes towards the mid lane this patch, mostly in the form of item changes. There were a lot of cost reductions and just general power up for a lot of the burst and some of the more expensive mage items in the game at the moment. The two direct changes were to both Smolder and Cho'Gath. In the case of Cho'Gath, they were trying to push him away from the mid lane, more into top lane, but it just ended up being more generalistic power given to him. In the case of Smolder, it was a pretty heavy buff. He still underperforms quite heavily in the mid lane. Definitely really performing quite well in the bot lane though, which is where they are kind of targeting the nerfs towards him in 25.11 too. Let's get into it. So to begin with, the D-tier is going to lead off with Smolder still. Smolder doesn't really perform that well in either solo lane for the average player. In competitive and elite, you can oftentimes find spots where this champion performs a bit better, but he's a bit more counter pick reliant, and if you can find those spots, then yeah, I think there are angles with the buffs and even before the buffs. But right now, I'd recommend playing him in the bot lane. He performs really well there, has really good pairings, and his kit has generally been shifted towards being more powerful in that lane to try and get him out of competitive in the solo lanes. The other champions which remain in the D tier are the likes of Tristana and Corki, which have also received changes similar to Smolder in the past to kind of push them more towards the bot lane. In the case of Tristana, she's a performant bot laner at the moment. Corki, not so performant for the average player, but still performs quite well in elite, being very oppressive early on in the game, having access to very good wave clear. But both these champions still underperform in the mid lane. Do better the further up into elite and competitive you go. Ziggs, even with the buffs towards the items like Luden's receiving 100 gold cost reduction, isn't performing amazingly. He remains as a high D tier pick. I don't think he is unplayable, but I would recommend most things over him. There are rarely spots outside of being like an OTP where I'd recommend him over some of the other mages in the game at the moment. In the case of Twisted Fate, he is being buffed in 25.11. He's not terrible at the moment. The buffs towards Lichbane did help him. Roa is slightly weaker though at the moment with the nerfs it received in 25.9, and he does underperform generalistically. I would also recommend other mages over him, which is why I leave him in the D tier as is. And Azir is an incredibly hard mage to get value out of in solo queue, unless you are very, very comfortable on the champion and you to an extent know that your teammates will give you the resources and enable you to have the control in team fights to allow you to output that damage. This champion tends to underperform very aggressively. It is a very hard champion to play. It needs very specific, well, not so much specific, but it needs certain conditions to really function compared to some of the other mages, and you just don't really find yourself in the environment which is what allows this champion to be so strong in high elo and competitive in a lot of situations. Moving on to the C tier, then we lead off with Gangplank, who underperforms in the mid lane. He generally doesn't perform that well across the board. In fact, he just isn't popular enough to really continue adding into the tier list, so I'm going to remove him for this patch. The other picks within C tier are the likes of Brand, who is also generally just underperforming across the board. This champion should probably be slightly better. And then afterwards, Leandry, this patch does affect him. Losing 10 AP on the item is meaningful. It will hurt certain wave clear pressure points, and it will sometimes just deny you kills as your abilities aren't going to be doing as much damage. Jace is an incredibly hard mid laner to play. You have to space incredibly effectively, and if you can, then yeah, you can get value out of this pick. But once again, he mostly sits towards the low end of the tier list, like some of the other options, because of their difficulty to play. And for average healers, I just don't really recommend some of these options as consistent ways of climbing, unless you're an OTP, a Smurf, or someone who is very consistent at the kind of concepts that these champions want to bring into the game. Aurora just underperforms for the average player. I don't think she's as difficult as some of the other options down here, but her general audience isn't hugely wide at the moment, and for the kind of audience which she does serve, she isn't as performant as I believe she probably should be. She still performs well in elite and competitive though, which is why I haven't just gone and buffed her. But for the average player, probably not a pick I'm going to recommend, albeit she did benefit from some of the mage item changes this patch. And you can do some optimization. I believe both Luden's and Storm Surge and even Malignants are all good options on her if you want to opt into them within specific games as an alternative to your Leandries, for example. Gragas remains a C2 option. He also just performs under the bar in the mid lane. You're rarely going to see this champion outside of OTPs playing it, but it is a flex option if you do so want to opt into it. And yeah, some of those items did get buffed, like your Ludens if you want to opt into it, and your Storm Surges, your your Lich Banes if you do opt into those kind of items in his build path. Mel is, I believe, probably going to be bumped up soon. There are some optimizations which need to be done on this champion for her to kind of like be as comparable. I think people should start maxing E in some matchups because the abilities are very strong, and having the CC go up on that ability combined with the wave clear threshold breakpoints, I think does give her a lot of power. Obviously, as like default, most people do just Q-max on this champion, but there are those alternatives which can be opted into. And yeah, I think the champion will benefit from some of these optimizations. It does remain in the C tier at the moment, but it did benefit from some of the mage item changes. So in time, yeah, we'll probably get bumped up to the B tier. If you're comfortable or you want to put time into Mel, then I think this champion is in a reasonable spot as is, but could probably still gain some power and still be in a relatively balanced kind of state for mid lane. Bot lane Mel does look very strong though, so I'd recommend that primarily as her main role. Kassadin is underperforming from the Roa and the Seraph's nerfs. He does also have some, like, I mean, some of his builds are stronger later on into the game, like Lich Bane being slightly more powerful, and Rabadon having the 100 gold cost is nice for him. But he, yeah, it's mostly late game skewed changes, and obviously Malignance also gain 5 AP if you do opt into the item. He is being changed in 25.11. The changes actually don't look particularly huge in terms of win rate moving, like in terms of bringing his power up. They look to be relatively focused on power shifting. The E is gaining 10 base damage at all ranks, and the base armor of the champion is going up by 3, I believe, from 18 to 21. It will help in some of those AD matchups and give him a bit of power early on into the game, but the late game power is going to obviously be siphoned out from his ultimate. The AP ratio is going down on that spell, so that will be meaningful as well. I don't really know where he will land after the changes. Be really interesting to see. Right now, I don't really recommend the champion. I do think he is in a bit of a weak spot. Ryze is underperforming at the moment. The similar reasons for why Kassadin's underperforming. Both Roa and Seraphs are the two major items which I believe have been nerfed the most in the last 2 patches, and Ryze is getting also buffed in 25.11. The buffs look way too big. I think the champion will end up being hotfix nerfed if they don't cut back before they push those changes to live. It is mostly focused around buffing up his EQ damage early onto the game, and on the preview they are also taking 10 damage off his W, which is nice if people do opt into W first on Ryze, as that can enable him to trade quite aggressively level 1. But I do think the power from given to the EQ is incredibly powerful at the moment, and probably shouldn't be as much of a buff as it currently is, which they're targeting towards live. Moving on to the B tier, then we lead off with LeBlanc. Actually, there's one other champion we're going to drop some C tier, but I'll talk about LeBlanc first. She benefited from some of the mage item changes. A lot of the AP assassins have just naturally gone up with these buffs, which is good to see. It enables some more variety. Obviously, LeBlanc is a very frustrating champion for a lot of people and a lot of champions, as her high mobility, her high burst potential, and some of the wave clear she's been given over time have enabled her to be, just puts her in a pretty frustrating spot when she is strong in the game, and she is definitely going towards that bar as is. So definitely a champion to be careful of. I would recommend learning her if you are someone who is kind of thinking about it on the fence about whether they want to pick the champion up. Dropping down from the B to the C tier is Yone. There are some champions which are going to have just lost power with some of the other things moving up, and Yone is one of those champions. He was towards the low end of the B tier. He's now in the C tier. The nerf towards his W, I believe in 25.8, it might be in 25.9, did affect him. It was a meaningful amount of trading power to lose. He won't as consistently find lethal early or even later on into the game, because it was just a power down across the game, and yeah, that has led him to be more of a C tier champion now, but some of the other picks around him have been buffed. Some of the other low B tier picks are your Morganas, which are conditional at best. I don't really recommend playing Morgana, but if you can find the spots, she has a pretty simplistic kit, and if you're given the setup and those matchups, then I think Morgana can be an option to lean into if you already play it. If you don't, I just don't really recommend this champion. I think she has issues with her kit. Some of the attack options like your Scions and your Malphites still remain as okay B-tier options. They're not going to give you as much agency, but Malphite and some of the AD champions combined with the AP build can be a solid option to lean into. Malignance and Storm Surge got buffed, which are 2 items he sometimes goes when he goes that route. Case of Sion, he's a good stonewall against some of the mages, opting into like Hollow Radiance, and Kanek Rukun can make it really hard to move this champion out of lane, and can definitely make him an effective mid laner. You are just sacrificing some level of agency if you opt into him. Asol sits towards the higher end of the B tier now. The major item buffs also helped him, and he will be moving slightly further up, albeit he still leans into Blackfire and Rylai, and Leandry is an item he opts into, which is slightly weaker. So yeah, early onto the build, relatively power neutral, if anything, slightly powered down, but later on, the cheaper Rabadon, but being able to opt into Crypt Bloom, even Bloodletter's Curse all work really nicely on him as well. Zed and Talon and Kiana, like some of the AD options within the B tier, they can still perform really well if you're very comfortable on them. They're just not picks I as highly recommend as some of the options higher up, as I do think they are very difficult champions to play and often create very high volatility games. But if you're comfortable with that, and that is what you kind of enjoy about the game, then yeah, these picks can definitely get you results. I don't think they're bad by any means. I just think you have to put a lot of time into them to really get the results you are looking for. Fizz remains as a B tier assassin. He did benefit from some of the mage item changes as well, like your Lich Banes and your Storm Surge are nicer for him, and he sits as a high B tier. I'd recommend him primarily as a counter pick, but if you are comfortable playing Fizz, you can play him into most things and find good results as the champion. Tends to be obviously lent towards like a lot of assassins being a main of the pick, and I do recommend maining a champion. That is the best and most effective way to climb, as just understanding your matchup tables is really, really valuable knowledge to have. Lissandra also sits towards the high end of the B tier, benefits from some of the changes, still sits as more of a counter pick option though in her current state. Silas and Oriana still remain as B tier options. Silas benefited from Protobelt being buffed, it's a nicer item on him, but he's still dependent on being more of a counter pick at the moment, which is why he remains as a B tier option alongside Lissandra and Fizz. Oriana is just slightly below the bar. Most of the B tier and like high B tier options can consistently compete with the A tier options, especially if they're utilized as counter picks. They're just not as what I'd recommend like main picks at the moment over some of the A tier options, which are either more consistent or just more powerful than them in their current states. Moving up to the A tier then are a couple of champions. We lead off with Katarina, who really benefited from the Lich Bane and the Nashortooth buffs if you do opt into those two items. And yeah, Katarina oftentimes massively fluctuates depending on how much time you've put into the champion. If you've never played Katarina before, she's a D tier champion. If you've played a lot of Katarina, you'll still continue to play a lot of Katarina, and she will be like an S tier option for you. She is in a really good state at the moment, and if you play the champion, I would definitely continue to recommend playing the champion. If you want to learn Katarina, you do have to sink a lot of time to her, and you should never learn Katarina in solo queue. She's a very, very hard champion to play. Zoe, Akali, Kennen all move up. All similar reasons. They have received item buffs, which have definitely helped them find a good spot within the mid lane meta. Zoe is definitely one of the higher options at the moment. I think Zoe is a high A tier option, close to even S tier option. She received a couple of buffs, and then these changes have really solidified her as a very solid option, especially if you've put the time into playing her. Kennen, also Splinter, I believe it is, who has showed that Kennen mid in Korea is an incredibly powerful pick. The buff towards Protobelt really helped it. I am moving up from the B to the A tier. He's a champion which, yeah, you want to put some time into playing, but yeah, is in a relatively good spot for mid lane in his current state. Some of the other picks which are moving down are the likes of Garen, who didn't benefit from the mage item changes. He lost some power in the mid lane as some of the champions around him got slightly better. He does drop down to the B tier. He is being changed in 25.11 though, quite sizably, so that will definitely shift his placement quite aggressively. Vel'Koz dropping down. He actually lost some power, I believe, from Horizon Focus being nerfed, and he does have a load of build variations which can kind of make up for some of his power loss. Like, I think both Ludens and Blackfire are pretty competitive first item options. You can opt into like Leandry, Horizon Focus. I believe there's one other item you can opt into second, which still like performs on a relatively similar level, maybe even Storm Surge, I believe. And yeah, I think you can make back some of that if you're picking the right builds in the right games, but he is generally powered down compared to where he was in the previous patch. Aurelia also drops down, still a high B tier option, and if you're already comfortable with a champion, you'll still continue to play her, but she's not quite as competitive with some of the A tier options, which like you want to put a lot of time into. So yeah, I don't recommend her as much at the moment. Victor still remains as an A tier option. You do have both the I mean, you have a couple of build variations on him. You have the Roa build variation, giving you a bit more durability, the Ludens, which gives you a bit more upfront burst, and the Blackfire, which gives you a bit better of an extended trading pattern. I think, honestly, you can opt into a lot of them depending on what kind of game you're playing, and right now, I'd say, yeah, he's a pretty solid A tier option. If you enjoy Victor, then you can continue to play him and you should still be able to find results. He's not quite as challenging as some of the other, well, he's not quite as challenging as the AP, like, assassin options, but he is one of the, yeah, he fits in quite nicely with, like, the other AP traditional mages at the moment. Veigar is very low elo skewed. I don't really recommend Veigar as much at the moment. I'm honestly close to dropping him down to the B tier. I think his audience is, like, probably like Emerald and below. I think after Emerald, you're definitely going to struggle compared to some of the other mage options. He just takes too long to come online. But there are some of the items which got buffed did benefit him, like Rabadon's, for example, being slightly cheaper, enables him to pick it up slightly early on to the game, and that can be nice for him. Vex remains as an A2 option. The champion has, I mean, it's still an incredible counter pick, and did just benefit from some of the item buffs as well. Heimerdinger also benefited from some of the buffs. If you opt into, like, Rabadon, Storm Surge, and you're looking for a bit more burst, then, yeah, he would definitely gain power from that. He did lose some power from Liandry being nerfed, so he does remain as, like, a pretty niche A-tier option. Quinn, also like around the niche A tier option kind of picks, probably could also be, probably sits as like a low A tier option now. The general kind of level going up in the mid lane has also meant that Quinn has generally lost some power, as she's not as consistently going to snowball against some of the mage options as before. Ari sits as an A2 option. The buff towards Malignance is quite nice for her if you opt into it. Roa is still a fine option. Blackfire is still a fine option. I think Ari has, like Victor, a couple of build options she can lean into, depending on what she needs within the game, and she still sits as a very solid A tier option. Lux, Xerath are some of your more longer range mages within the mid lane. I don't believe Xerath is doing quite as well at the moment. I think he, like Vel'Koz, also suffered a bit from Horizon Focus being nerfed, so he probably sits towards the mid to low end of the A tier, but still a very solid option. Lux, incredible wave clear, incredible burst potential. I think Lux is an underrated mid laner as is, and still remains as a pretty solid A tier option. Syndra sits in the A tier, also pretty solid A tier option. Don't think she's the high end of the A tier, but I think if you're comfortable with a champion, she can perform quite nicely for you at the moment. Annie, on the other hand, definitely towards the high end of the A tier. I think Annie is performing really well with the buffs she received in the previous patch. Combined with some of the mage item buffs this patch, she has definitely found her footing quite nicely within the mid lane. She's being nerfed, I believe, in 25.11, which makes sense. She is definitely overperforming. I believe she could probably even be bumped up to the S tier, but I'm kind of leaving her here right now because I don't believe her builds are quite as refined as they probably should be at the moment. And there is definitely some like learning to be done with the champion, considering its play pattern has definitely shifted compared to where it was in, I believe, 25.7 before she received her changes, which was mostly focused around really amping up Tibbers to make him as strong as possible. And Tibbers has definitely had a lot of power siphoned out of him. Some of the other options remaining in the A tier are like Yahui's, who is still a very solid option. This champion does provide a lot of different tools to the game. He does lack mobility and can struggle if like into like dive compositions, but I do think he's still a very valuable champion to have within your arsenal. Cassiopeia probably sits towards the lower end of the A tier now. Didn't really benefit from the changes quite as much as some of the other champions, as she was someone who definitely opted into Roa and Seraphs a bit more consistently, and those two items are the two which got nerfed, so definitely has lost some power there. Kind of akin to Nivea, who probably sits towards the lower end of the A tier now as well. Well, I mean, this is like one of the few times Nivea has actually dropped out of the S tier. The champion is definitely doing a bit weaker now. Some of the other options within the A tier include the likes of Talia, who is also a very high A tier option. The champion has been a pretty standard mid lane option to go to for a while, and generally some of the item changes have just benefited her. She is a pretty big competitive mainstay, I believe, at the moment. Being able to opt into combos like Talia, Pantheon, and just Talia AD jungles in general can be quite nice for her. Pantheon doing really well in the mid lane at the moment. Great tools to shut down a lot of the AD picks, like your AD assassins and just your assassins in general, and being able to opt into things like Hex Drinker and more if you are playing into like those heavy AP compositions. I think the champion's not quite an S tier option, The fact that he provides very nice flex value definitely solidifies him as a very solid high-end A-tier champion. And Swain, I think Swain also sits towards the high end of the A-tier. He's a great counter pick. Might not be the premier of the A-tier, but definitely find those right compositions, like those tankier, lower damage compositions, and he can definitely be one of the best mages you can opt into in the game. Moving on to the S-tier then, I believe, actually, I will drop Neferi down. I think there was one other champion. Actually, Neferi and Malzahar are going to be dropped down. So Malzahar still sits towards the high end of the A tier, just dropped down from the S tier. Still really recommend this champion for his trivialization of wave clear and how nice he is as like an option to climb with, especially in your lower ranks. In case of Neferi, she did just lose some power with some of the other champions around her being buffed, and she sits as more like a mid-A tier option now. I still think the pick is really good, and it's definitely more niche within the mid lane, and hopefully as Jungle Neferi's ban rate goes down, you'll get more options to, like, opportunities to play mid lane Neferi. Moving on to the S tier then, we're going to lead off with Cho'Gath, who did get nerfed this patch. He is still a very solid mid lane option. He is being nerfed again in 25.11, as the changes were mostly focused around nerfing his Q-Max and buffing up his E-Max, but E-Max mid lane Cho can be something you opt into, and Q-Max Cho I don't believe lost enough power to really like hard the build in a substantial way. Kayle, I'm gonna go second with. I think Kayle really was one of the biggest winner of the changes towards the mage items this patch, with Nasha, Rabadon and Lichbane all being reduced in cost. Helps Kayle reach the point of the game where she is going to be stronger, and that is a huge thing for Kayle. She wants to get to those late game breakpoints, and being able to do that with a bit more ease, massive. And Kayle was already a relatively good champion. I think she deserves a spot within the S tier now. Neeko has really risen up in both the support role and the mid lane, especially with the Protobelt buffs, as a very, very strong option. I think if you can play Neeko, she might be the best option for you in the game at the moment. If you don't, I'd recommend putting some time into her. She's definitely a bit more complicated and not as traditional as some of the other mage options, but if you understand her combos and how to really utilize her W and the passive, I think that is where the real strength of the champion lies, being able to do things like blocking skill shots and just scouting, stuff like that. All tools which can be really, really valuable on the champion. UAP Assassins, which are doing really well in the mid lane at the moment, are both Echo and Diana. I really do recommend these champions if you're looking for something which are with incredible snowball potential and can definitely take over the game with 2-3 kills. I think these picks are definitely perfect for that at the moment. Diana, incredibly lane skewed. This champion does a huge amount and tends to struggle towards the later parts of the game, but if you can snowball his advantages, I think these picks are perfect at the moment. Galio is an incredible anti-mage, and with mages being more popular this patch, I think he fits really nicely in the S tier. I do think he has some issues with builds, especially if you end up blinding the champion. I think that's obviously going to be a bit more of a struggle of the champion, but it's an intended struggle. I don't think Galio is healthy when he is blindable, but you can still opt into like your AP burst builds, and with Electrocute and Storm Surge and some like Rabadons, for example, all being buffed, and like Protobelt being a really good option on him. I think he does have a lot of tools he can opt into, and definitely, yeah, I think he can work as an AP burst mage as well. So Galio, definitely a pick I do recommend at the moment. Vladimir, also an incredible pick in his current state. Has definitely risen up over time, and the buff towards Rabadons, the buff towards Protobelt, the buff towards Storm Surge, the buff towards like Crypt Bloom, maybe even Horizon Focus in the next patch. I think Vladimir's postured in an incredible spot in the mid lane at the moment. And then Yasuo is my recommended AD option. He's just been chilling here for a bit. He's an incredible pick. He's incredibly popular, and I really do recommend just having Yasuo as like an AD champion within your arsenal for mid lane, as yeah, I think he's a great pick, especially in his current state with the buffs he received to his Q not too long ago. Those are my thoughts, but I really do recommend like the S tier options at the moment. I think there are pretty clear-cut, like good picks to opt into at the moment, but a lot of the A tier and a lot of the B tier can really easily compete with them if you have put the time in. Like being an OTP at the moment, it's really, really valuable. Just understanding your matchups is, yeah, just the most valuable way about going with climbing. Even like your C tier options, if you put a lot of time into them, can outperform S tier options if you just don't understand the matchups that well. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.